This video will cover section 1.4 on quadratic equations. So we have talked about linear equations, and we said the way that we knew it was linear was because when we looked at the variable, whatever it may have been, x, y, whatever, that variable was not in the denominator. There was nothing else going on with the variable. It was simply just an x. And because it had an exponent of 1, that made it linear. Alright, well, if we're talking about quadratic equations, they can be written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Notice the x squared. So we're looking at the largest exponent on the variable. If that largest exponent happens to be a 2, alright, and it's not down in the denominator and there's nothing else happening to it, no absolute value or radicals or anything else, then we would call this a quadratic equation. Alright, and this here, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, is written in standard form. Alright, now when we get ready to solve these quadratic equations, that's the form they need to be written in, and notice it is everything on the left side equal to 0. Now there are a couple of methods we use to solve quadratic equations. One of those is the zero factor property, and so this is where that factoring comes in that we've been practicing. Alright, and it says if a and b are complex numbers with ab equal to 0, then what that means is either a equals 0 or b equals 0 or both of them equal 0. And so what we're going to do is we're going to factor out these quadratic expressions into our factors. Just like a is a factor and b is a factor, we're going to have some factors and we're going to set them equal to 0 and find what x values make the left side of this equation be a 0. Okay, so if it says the zero factor property, you want to factor it if it will, and then set each factor equal to 0 and solve for x. And so let's try that out. Alright, we have x squared plus 2x minus 15. This is a quadratic or a trinomial of the form x squared. Alright, so with that being said, I know the first term in each parenthesis is an x. I'm looking to find what multiplies to give me negative 15, and then it's going to add to give me positive 2. So I'm going to list out the factors of negative 15. There'll be 1 and 15 and 3 and 5. Alright, remember the first operator in this problem is a plus sign. That tells us the sign of our larger factor. So I'm going to come over here and give those both a positive. Now when I multiply my factors together, I need to get a negative number. That means my signs need to be opposites. And since my larger one is positive, that means my smaller one needs to be negative. Now, to know which two to choose, I add them together. Alright, and I'm going to choose the two that add to give me this middle term, and that is 2, and that looks like the factors negative 3 and positive 5. So I'm going to drop those in. Alright, don't leave your equals 0 off, because this is still an equation. Alright, so now what we're going to do is using this right here. Alright, we're going to take each factor, so we're going to take x minus 3. We're going to set it equal to 0. Alright, notice now this is a linear equation. And so you know how to solve those. You want to get the x by itself. We're going to do that by adding 3 to both sides. Alright, and in all of these, what's going to happen is this is just going to change signs. And if there, I'll show you, let me not say that. And if there happens to be more, we'll see that later. Alright, x plus 5 equals 0. I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides to get x equals negative 5. Now if you take 3 and you fill it back in, we'll get 9 plus 6 is 15, minus 15 is 0, which does equal 0. So we know this answer works. And if I fill in a negative 5, I'll get negative 5 squared is 25, minus 10 is 15, minus another 15 is 0, which matches the right side. Alright, let's try the zero property on the next problem. Alright, it's asking me to factor. Okay, so I don't see any GCF on the left. I'm set equal to 0, so I'm in the correct form. Alright, so I'm going to slide my 10 down with my 2 because it's not just x squared now, it's an ax squared form. This gives me x squared plus x minus 20. Alright, then I'm going to factor that out. Because it's of the form x squared, I know x's go in the first term of each parenthesis. I'm looking for what will give me a negative 20. So I have 1 and 20, 2 and 10, and 4 and 5. My larger factor is positive. When I multiply the two factors together, I need a negative. So since my larger one is positive, that means my smaller one needs to be negative. I'm going to add those together to decide which one of the three I need. That is there. So I put in negative 4, positive 5. Now the 10 that I slid down, I need to divide by that 10. Alright, the 4 over 10 should reduce to 2 over 5. And then the 5 over 10 will reduce to 1/2. Alright, now, this is where slide and divide method helps out. Because if you're using the slide and divide method, you can actually stop here to get the answer. Alright, and the answer is simply going to be... Hey!
Can I get them notes?
Alright, we're going to set it equal to 0. And so then we'll get x equals positive 2/5 and x equals negative 1/2. Now notice that's just opposite sides. Now these aren't the actual factors of that expression, but if using slide and divide, it will lead you to the x value. So if we were going all the way to get the factors, or if you use a different method to factor it out, these are going to be your two factors, which you will then set equal to 0. Alright, and when you solve for x, you end up with x equals 2/5 and x equals negative 1/2, which notice is the same thing we got using slide and divide method, and that saved us some time. So if you use a different method besides slide and divide, you're going to end with these two factors, which you will then set equal to 0 and solve for x. But if you use slide and divide and you're solving an equation, this right here will lead you to your x values.